On a perfect July afternoon, an 11-year-old girl vanished from a church picnic, leaving behind only a folded sweater and a camera no one dared to open. 20 years later, the film finally surfaced, and one blurred figure in the last frame seems to be staring back. The July sun was warm over the church meadow, filling the air with the smell of cut grass and grilled food. Families gathered on blankets spread across the wide lawn. Children ran with bare feet across the field, and women carried baskets of pies and fried chicken from the long wooden tables. It was the yearly church picnic, a tradition so steady that it seemed nothing could ever disturb it. The old steeple looked down on the gathering with a kind of watchful calm. The bells already rung earlier in the morning service. There was laughter and the sound of hymns drifting from the older members who sang while they prepared lemonade. And everything had the glow of a summer afternoon meant to linger in memory. Among the children was 11-year-old Emily Whitaker, a small girl with sun-streaked hair and a smile that seemed ready for every face that looked her way. She had a simple cotton dress on, pale blue with a white ribbon at the waist, and she carried her small Kodak camera that she had begged to bring. She clicked photos of her friends swinging on the tire near the fence, of her mother laughing with other women, of the table heavy with food that never seemed to end. Each click of the shutter was a way for her to hold on to the joy of the day, as if she already knew that such moments were fragile. Her parents were proud to see her so full of energy, though they told her not to stray too far. Emily nodded, but her attention was always half on the woods that bordered the meadow. The tall trees stood quiet, green and dark, and to a child they looked like a secret waiting to be discovered. She would glance back often, perhaps measuring the distance, perhaps only curious. Her mother called her once to bring a plate of potato salad to the blanket, and she obeyed quickly, but soon she was running again with her camera, calling for her friends to pose. The air grew thicker as the afternoon wore on, the heat pressing down, yet the mood never dimmed. Fathers tossed balls back and forth, little ones clung to their mothers' skirts, and teenagers whispered at the edge of the field, hiding their laughter in the shade. The hymn that rose from the crowd of elders faded into small talk and the sweet hush of bees drifting around the jars of lemonade. Emily snapped another picture, and then another, winding the little wheel with care. Her father teased her about using up the whole roll on pies and trees, but she only grinned and ran toward the edge of the meadow again. When someone noticed her blanket later, her sweater folded neatly on top and her plate half filled, they assumed she was off playing. Children often disappeared in groups for games of hide and seek, and no one was alarmed at first. The sun was still high, the sky wide and blue, and it seemed impossible that anything dark could intrude on such a day. The laughter rolled on, the hymns rose again, and for a while the absence of one small girl was hidden beneath the music of summer. The late afternoon light spread long across the meadow, softening the bright edges of the day. Families were beginning to pack away food. Children slowed from running and instead sat in little groups, and the chatter of the church elders drifted like a low hum. On the Whitaker blanket a plate of food rested untouched, potato salad warm from the sun, and beside it lay Emily's small folded sweater. It was the kind of sweater mothers always made their children carry in case the evening cooled, and her mother had smiled when she saw it neatly placed there. But now, as the minutes passed, that sweater became a marker, a signal that something was not right. At first her mother thought Emily was simply with the other girls by the swings, or perhaps down by the creek at the far end of the field. She called her name lightly, not with alarm, but with the voice that expects an answer to come right back. No answer did. She stood and shaded her eyes, scanning the meadow where boys were throwing a ball and the older girls were braiding each other's hair. She saw faces she knew, but not her daughter's. She called again, louder this time, and her husband, noticing the change in her tone, rose from his chair. It is strange how quickly unease spreads through a gathering. A moment earlier all was laughter and music, and then a mother's voice lifted sharp with worry, and everyone began to notice. The Whitakers asked nearby families if Emily was with their children, each question answered with a shake of the head. The minister himself stepped closer, concern softening his kind face, and suggested perhaps Emily had gone to fetch water. Her father walked toward the tables, scanning each group, his stride quickening when he found nothing. The sweater remained on the blanket, a small piece of order in the rising tide of confusion. It seemed so deliberate, folded with care, not dropped in haste. Her mother knelt beside it and touched the soft wool as if it might speak. She felt the heat of the fabric and imagined her daughter had only just left it. The camera that Emily had been carrying was nowhere in sight, and the absence of both child and camera left a hollow space that deepened with every second. Soon, other voices called her name across the meadow, voices of friends and neighbors, and the air lost its ease. Some children grew quiet, sensing the weight of the moment, while others were hurried back to their parents' sides. A few men started toward the woods, their figures dark against the pale grass, and the sound of snapping twigs echoed back. Mothers clutched their little ones close, eyes darting, as if shadows now lurked at the edge of the trees. The plate on the blanket still held food, untouched and wilting, and the sweater stayed folded just so. They became symbols of interruption, of a life paused mid-gesture. The picnic that had begun as a celebration now shifted into something else, a scene suspended in fear. The sun lowered, stretching shadows long across the field, and every eye searched for the small figure who had been there only moments before but now was nowhere at all. The sky dimmed quickly once the sun slid past the hills, the heat of the day fading into a heavy summer night. Lanterns were lit and flashlights passed from hand to hand, their thin beams slicing across the meadow where the picnic had ended in confusion. The tables stood mostly empty now, paper plates tossed aside, but the laughter and hymns that had filled the air only hours before were gone. In their place came the steady sound of voices calling a single name, over and over, drifting into the dark like prayers. Emily's mother stood near the blanket where the sweater still rested, her hands pressed together so tightly the knuckles had turned white. Neighbors tried to comfort her, but her eyes searched the field with a desperate hope that seemed to shrink with every unanswered call. Her father moved in quick strides, first toward the swings, then toward the creek, then back again, his voice sharp and frantic. The minister stayed close by, his face set with worry, as he helped direct the gathering crowd into search parties. The sheriff's car arrived with a crunch of gravel, its headlights sweeping across the field like a spotlight. 2 deputies stepped out, their uniforms marked by the dust of the county roads. They spoke with the parents briefly, then began to organize the search more firmly. Bloodhounds were unloaded from the back of a truck, their long noses low to the ground as handlers clipped on leashes. The crowd parted to make way, murmurs rising like a low tide. When the dogs were given the scent from Emily's sweater, they pulled hard toward the edge of the meadow, noses leading them straight to the tree line. A hush fell, broken only by the hounds' eager cries. Flashlights bobbed as men and women followed, weaving into the woods where branches hung low and the air smelled of damp earth. The undergrowth crackled underfoot, each sound sharp in the silence of night. Children too young to join were taken home, their mothers clinging to them with renewed fear. For those who stayed, the woods seemed endless, each shadow capable of hiding something terrible. The calls of Emily stretched thin, echoing back in eerie tones. The creek was searched carefully, lantern light glimmering on the surface of the slow water. Men waded in boots, probing with sticks, while others scanned the banks for any sign of clothing or footprints. Nothing was found. The dogs pulled deeper into the trees, circling, confused by too many scents and the passage of hours. Some thought they caught a trail, but it vanished quickly in the night air. Back at the meadow, cars lined the dirt road, their headlights left on to push back the dark. The women gathered near the tables, whispering prayers, their hands clutching hymn books as if the words inside might shield them. The father returned again and again to the blanket, staring at the sweater, as though if he looked long enough Emily would come running to claim it. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The search spread outward into barns and sheds, into ditches along the roads, yet each new place ended in silence. By dawn the meadow looked worn, trampled by many feet, but it held no answers. The people who had filled it with joy the day before now stood weary and hollow-eyed. The search had begun with confidence, but as the first light touched the steeple of the church, a grim realization settled over them. Emily Whittaker had not been found, and the world they thought was safe had shifted forever. Morning light revealed tired faces and trampled grass, the meadow no longer a place of joy but a ground heavy with sorrow. The people who had searched through the night gathered in small clusters, their voices lowered, their eyes avoiding the empty blanket that still held Emily's sweater. There had been no trace of her, no footprints that led anywhere certain, no scrap of fabric caught in the branches, no sound in the night to suggest where she had gone. The absence of answers became a weight that pressed down on everyone, and into that silence the first theories began to rise. Some whispered that Emily might have wandered into the woods and lost her way, perhaps frightened by the darkness and hiding until morning. Men who had combed the trees shook their heads at that, saying the dogs would have found her if she were near, saying no child could vanish without leaving at least a trail. Others feared she had slipped into the creek and been carried downstream, though those who searched the water swore there had been nothing, no disturbed mud, no ripples beyond their own boots. When the simplest explanations failed, the conversations grew darker. A runaway, someone suggested, though it sounded weak even as the word was spoken. Emily was 11, a child still clinging to dolls and bedtime stories, not a girl plotting an escape from her family. Her mother bristled at the idea, shaking her head fiercely, saying her daughter would never have left without a word. Still, The rumor grew legs, carried by those who needed some explanation, any explanation, that would soften the harder truths pressing at the edges of their minds. The sheriff stood before the gathered families, his face lined and tired, his voice even but grave. He said nothing was ruled out. He spoke of abduction in careful tones, as if the word itself might tear the community apart. Some glanced at the strangers who had driven by the picnic that day, farmhands and truckers on the county road, their faces blurred by distance. Others remembered a dark sedan parked near the church earlier, unfamiliar and out of place. A handful whispered about someone inside the community, someone trusted, for how else could a child vanish from a crowd without a cry? Suspicion seeped into the air like smoke. Parents clutched their children tighter, husbands eyed their neighbors with unease, and every story from the past was suddenly reshaped into warning. A man recalled seeing Emily at the edge of the woods, camera in hand, though he had thought little of it at the time. A woman said she noticed her walking with another child, though she could not remember who. Every memory was tested, every detail dissected, and still nothing pointed to certainty. By evening, the once solid fabric of the town had frayed. Faith battled with fear, prayer with doubt. Theories circled like carrion birds, feeding on silence, never landing on truth. And through it all, the blanket remained in the grass, the sweater folded neatly, mute and stubborn, refusing to tell what it knew. The second day after Emily disappeared, the meadow looked different, as though joy had been washed out of its colors. The church picnic tables were gone. The hymn books had been carried back inside, but the ground still bore the marks of many feet pressing down in worry and in search. Deputies moved slowly across the grass, bending to study the earth for signs, their radios crackling softly, their eyes sharp for anything overlooked. On the Whitaker blanket, the small folded sweater remained, but beside it lay something that until then had drawn little attention: Emily's Kodak camera. It was a simple plastic Instamatic, the kind children often carried, its strap looped and twisted, the casing scratched from use. At first it was gathered like any other personal belonging, placed carefully in an evidence bag with the sweater and shoes. One of the deputies shook it gently and heard the faint rattle inside. The roll of film was still there, unspent, locked away in darkness. The discovery was not dramatic, not the breakthrough everyone prayed for, but it was something solid, something that belonged to Emily, and it gave the searchers a fragile hope. Her mother stared at the camera when it was shown to her, her face pale and hollow with worry. She remembered her daughter darting between the tables, laughing as she snapped pictures of friends and food, proud of being trusted with such a grown-up thing. The thought that Emily's last hours might be preserved inside that little box of film filled her with both fear and desperate longing. Perhaps the images would show her path across the meadow. Perhaps they would reveal who she was with. Perhaps they would whisper the answer no one had yet found. The sheriff spoke in a careful tone, explaining that the film could be developed, though its age and the heat of the day might have damaged it. Still, he promised to send it with urgency to the state lab. Around him the crowd leaned closer, their silence heavy. Neighbors who had been searching the woods now fixed their hopes on the tiny square of plastic, as though it carried the voice of the missing girl herself. Rumors swirled quickly once the camera was mentioned. Some said Emily had been fascinated with taking pictures near the tree line. Others recalled her kneeling by the creek with it. Others claimed she had aimed it at strangers on the road. Every memory was shaped into possibility. Every uncertain glimpse made more important now that the child was gone. The deputies wrote down each statement, their notebooks filling with fragments of stories that might or might not align. That evening, the blanket was folded and taken away, leaving a pale patch of pressed grass behind. The camera, sealed in its bag, seemed suddenly heavier than it was, as if it carried not only pictures, but also the weight of the town's fear. No one said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. If Emily had vanished into the silence, then perhaps her last act had been to leave behind a clue in plain sight, and until the film was developed, that little box of plastic and glass became the only voice she had left. The weeks after Emily's disappearance slipped into months, and the sharp urgency that had filled the town began to thin like smoke carried by the wind. At first the search had been constant. The woods lined with volunteers, the creek checked again and again, barns and sheds opened with trembling hands. Deputies knocked on every door, asking the same questions, writing the same notes. Posters with Emily's school photo were stapled to telephone poles, the corners curling in the sun, her smile staring out at neighbors and strangers alike. For a while, people still believed that answers were just around the bend, that one more lead, one more long night would bring her back. But seasons changed, and still there was nothing. By winter, the posters were faded, some torn away by storms, others scribbled on by careless hands. The sheriff's office held weekly briefings that soon turned into monthly, until eventually they stopped altogether. Each time a tip arrived, hope flickered, but each time it was extinguished when nothing came of it. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Emily's description in a nearby town, but the girl was found, and she was someone else. Another said they remembered a dark sedan parked by the church, but no plate number was ever given, and no one else could confirm it. Leads multiplied, but none held weight. The Whitaker home grew heavy with silence. Her father stopped attending services as regularly, unable to sit in the pews beneath the watchful eyes of a community that whispered its theories behind folded hands. Her mother clung to routine, setting a place for Emily at the table longer than anyone thought she should, keeping her bedroom neat and waiting as though the door might open at any moment. The camera film had been sent away, but results were delayed, then inconclusive. The images were blurred, damaged by time and heat. Only fragments showed, pieces of faces, corners of blankets, a blur of trees that meant little without context. Whatever truth Emily may have captured remained hidden in the gray shadows of ruined negatives. The town, too, began to shift. In the first months, neighbors had brought casseroles, had prayed together in circles that filled the Whitaker kitchen, had searched side by side in the fields. As time passed, those visits grew fewer, the prayers quieter, the food no longer left on the porch. People needed life to move forward, crops to tend, children of their own to raise. The memory of the picnic lingered, but it softened, pushed aside by the weight of ordinary days. Only for the Whitakers did time refuse to move. For them, the absence grew sharper, a wound that refused to close. By the end of the year, the case was filed into the cabinet of unsolved matters. The folder bore her name, and inside it lay copies of reports, faded maps of search grids, and a photograph of a smiling 11-year-old girl whose life had slipped into silence. The case had not been forgotten, but it had grown cold, the trail too faint to follow, the evidence too thin to hold. The town learned to live with the void, but in the quiet hours when the wind moved through the trees near the church meadow, many still thought of the little girl with the camera who had walked toward the woods and never returned. The weight of silence inside the Whitaker house became heavier with each passing season, filling the rooms like an unseen fog. At first, the family tried to hold together, clinging to prayer and routine, but the strain of not knowing, the endless waiting for a knock on the door that never came, wore them down slowly. Emily's bedroom remained untouched, the curtains drawn to keep out dust and sunlight, the bedspread smoothed each morning by her mother's hand. The presence of that small room, frozen in time, was both a comfort and a knife that cut fresh each day. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Her mother spent hours sitting at the edge of the bed, whispering prayers, begging for answers that did not arrive. She held the faded photographs close, running her thumb along the glossy paper until the edges wore thin. To her, Emily was still alive somewhere, and it became almost unbearable to listen when others spoke of acceptance. Her father, by contrast, grew tired of prayers that seemed to fall into a void. He stopped attending church as often, stopped joining in the hymns, and spent long evenings alone on the porch, staring into the dark with a glass of whiskey resting heavy in his hand. The silence between husband and wife grew wider, a gulf that neither knew how to cross. Emily's older brother tried to carry the weight in his own way. He was just a teenager then, but the night of the disappearance had marked him like a scar. At school, children whispered, some cruel, some curious, and he learned to keep his head down, to bury the shame and fear inside. He felt guilty for not watching her more closely, guilty for laughing with friends when she had slipped away unnoticed. That guilt hardened into anger, and as the years stretched on, he drifted further from home, unwilling to live under the shadow of a sister whose absence seemed to shape every breath his parents took. Arguments flared often in the house. The mother clung to the belief that Emily was alive, demanding new searches, new efforts, while the father insisted it was no use, that the girl was gone and only the grave truth remained. Their voices carried through the walls, breaking the fragile peace of the nights. Sometimes the arguments ended in silence that lasted for days, each retreating into their own corner of grief. Holidays once filled with warmth became hollow rituals, a chair left empty at the table, laughter forced until it broke into tears. Neighbors who had once been close friends grew distant, unsure how to approach a family so consumed by sorrow. Visits dwindled, conversations cut short, and soon, the Whitakers felt alone in their grief. The house itself reflected the fracture, paint peeling on the porch, the garden left untended, the walls once filled with music now holding only echoes. What had been a family of faith and closeness was slowly coming apart, not through choice but through the relentless pressure of unanswered questions. By the end of the second year, the family no longer moved as one. They shared the same roof, but not the same hope. The The mother lit a candle every evening, waiting for the return of a daughter who would not come. The father let the flame die, convinced the only truth left was loss. And the boy, caught between them, longed for escape, carrying with him the image of a sister frozen in memory, a family splintered into silence, and a home that had become more tomb than refuge. The years after Emily's disappearance settled like dust over the town, visible in every quiet pause and every glance that lingered too long. At first, the community had rallied, neighbors linking arms in prayer circles and volunteering for search parties. But when the leads failed and the case grew cold, that unity began to weaken. The absence of answers created a silence that was heavier than words, and into that silence suspicion seeped, quiet and corrosive. Families who once greeted each other with warmth now did so with hesitation, eyes searching for hidden meaning. Some believed a stranger had passed through, a nameless face that had taken Emily and vanished down the county road. Others whispered that it must have been someone local, someone who knew the picnic well enough to strike in plain sight. Those whispers did not fade. They grew into small stories told in kitchens and on porches, each one shaping the image of an unseen figure among them. The church, once the center of comfort, became a place where unease lurked just behind the hymns. Mothers kept their children closer during gatherings, watching the crowd with eyes that no longer trusted easily. Fathers stood at the edges of the meadow after services, scanning the tree line as if the shadows there still held danger. The pastor spoke often of faith and forgiveness, but even his voice could not chase away the thought that someone in their midst might know more than they had ever admitted. Some names were spoken in hushed tones, men who lived alone at the edge of town, families who had left suddenly after the summer of 1982, neighbors who had been seen near the woods that day. None of it was proven, none of it ever brought forward to the sheriff. Yet the suspicion itself was enough to fracture bonds built over generations. Invitations to suppers stopped coming, friendly visits ended without explanation, and a web of distance spread across the community. Children who had once run freely across the meadow were kept close to porches and yards, their parents warning them not to stray. Sleepovers ended, walks home from church were no longer taken alone, and the sense of safety that had defined the town seemed to vanish with Emily. The disappearance had created not only fear of the unknown but also fear of each other, a shadow that stretched across the years and colored every gathering. Even small things became sources of unease. A car idling too long on the road, a stranger stopping for directions, an unfamiliar knock after dark. Each carried with it the echo of that July day when a child with a camera had walked toward the edge of the field and never returned. The meadow grew back its grass, the swings still creaked in the wind, but to the people of the town those places were changed forever. They were marked by what had been lost, and by the suspicion that lingered like a stain. By the time 2 decades had passed, the community no longer spoke openly of Emily, but her absence remained in every silence, in every cautious glance, in every shadow that fell across the churchyard. The case had not only taken one child, it had taken the certainty of trust, leaving behind a place that looked the same, but no longer felt like home. In the spring of 2002, 20 years after Emily had vanished, her mother began the slow and painful process of clearing the attic. The house had grown quiet with age, the walls holding the silence of years, and though she had resisted it for so long, something inside her told her it was time. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, sunlight filtering in thin beams through a small round window. Boxes were stacked in uneven rows, some marked with dates, others with names, reminders of a life that once felt whole. She moved carefully, her hands brushing over forgotten toys, winter quilts, and Christmas ornaments that no longer held the same joy. Near the far corner, she found a cardboard box with Emily's name written across the top in her father's strong hand. The sight of it made her pause, her breath catching as if the air had been knocked out of her. She knelt, fingers trembling as she pulled it toward her. The cardboard was soft with age, the tape brittle and yellow. For years, she had avoided this box, knowing it contained fragments of her daughter's life. But on this day, she could not look away. She sat cross-legged on the wooden floor and slowly peeled back the tape. Inside were items that carried Emily's presence in a way that photographs never could. A collection of dolls with missing shoes, a hairbrush with strands of fine blonde hair tangled in its bristles, a school notebook filled with looping handwriting that had stopped forever in the 5th grade. Each object seemed to hum with memory, and each one deepened the ache that had never left her. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a worn handkerchief, she discovered something she had forgotten existed. It was Emily's second camera, the one she had been given the Christmas before she vanished. Smaller than the Kodak found on the picnic blanket, this one had never been developed or opened. The handkerchief had protected it, and when she held it up, The weight of it was undeniable. Turning it in her hands, she realized the film cartridge was still inside. Her first thought was disbelief. Could there really be images inside, trapped in the darkness of that film for 20 years? She had never been able to bring herself to open the box after Emily disappeared, and so the camera had slept untouched in the attic, carrying whatever secrets had been caught through its tiny lens. The possibility was overwhelming, both a gift and a threat. The thought of seeing Emily's face again, caught in an unguarded moment, was almost unbearable. Yet the thought of finding something she was not ready for filled her with dread. She placed the camera on her lap, staring at it until the beams of sunlight shifted across the floor. Eventually, she carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, where it sat like an accusation, demanding a choice. She knew she would take it to be developed, though fear made her hesitate. For 2 decades, she had lived with silence, and now this forgotten box had offered a chance to break it. What the photographs held, she could not yet know, but she understood that once opened, there would be no turning back. The summer of 2002 arrived with the same warm winds and heavy sunlight that had once carried laughter across the church meadow. Yet everything felt older, slower, as if the world itself carried the memory of what had been lost. 2 decades had passed since Emily vanished, and the town had learned to carry on, but time had not erased the shadow she left behind. Children who had once run through the fields were grown now, some with families of their own, and yet they still remembered the picnic where their friend disappeared. For them, the memory was like a scar, faded but permanent, a mark that shaped how they saw the world. The church still stood, the white paint weathered, the steeple casting a long shadow across the grass. Picnics were no longer held there. The elders said it was because the grounds were too small, or because the new park had better facilities, but everyone knew the truth. The meadow was too full of ghosts, and no one wished to spread blankets in a place where laughter had once turned to panic. Walking past it, people lowered their voices, as if noise might stir the silence that lingered there. For Emily's mother, the years had been marked not by seasons, but by absence. She had aged in ways that seemed faster than the calendar, her hair turning gray, her frame thinning. Each day was measured by small rituals, lighting a candle, folding the same quilt, pausing at the window to stare at the road that had never brought her daughter home. She carried on, but never fully, never without the ache. Her husband had not lasted as long under the strain. The weight of silence and the empty chair at the table had pulled him into bitterness, then into distance. He had died years earlier, leaving his wife to grieve not only for her missing child but also for the family they had once been. Emily's brother had built a life far away, though the absence of his sister followed him wherever he went. He rarely spoke of it, but in quiet moments he admitted to friends that it shaped every decision, every hesitation. He carried the guilt of a boy who believed he should have watched her more closely, though he had been only a child himself. That guilt became the silent thread woven through his adulthood, invisible but unbreakable. The town itself bore the wound in quieter ways. Neighbors still looked twice at strangers, mothers still warned their children not to wander, fathers still kept watchful eyes at gatherings. The memory of Emily had become a story told in careful tones, a warning more than a memory, a lesson about how quickly safety could vanish. The case was still spoken of as unsolved, the folder still in the cabinet at the sheriff's office, its pages yellowing with time. 2 decades later, the absence had not faded. It had only changed shape, from sharp grief into a quiet emptiness that touched every life it brushed. For some, she was a name spoken softly. For others, a face remembered only in photographs. But for her mother, she was still a daughter, 11 years old, frozen in time, waiting somewhere beyond the silence. The camera sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Emily's mother could bring herself to touch it again. Each time she passed, her eyes lingered on its dull plastic shell, and each time her hands trembled too much to pick it up. She imagined what might be hidden inside, a roll of film that had been sealed away for 20 years, a strip of moments frozen in darkness. It could be nothing but blur and shadow, ruined by age and heat, yet it could also hold the last images of her daughter, a final trace of her before she vanished. The weight of that possibility pressed down on her chest until breathing felt like a task. At night she dreamed of Emily running through the grass, her laughter carrying on the wind, the small camera bouncing against her chest on its strap. In the dreams, she always tried to call her back, but Emily only smiled and kept running, disappearing into the trees as the sound of the shutter clicked again and again. Each time she woke with tears on her pillow, her heart pounding as though she had truly heard that click in the dark. Her son, now grown and with a family of his own, came to visit and found her staring at the camera as if it might speak. He listened quietly as she told him about finding it in the attic, wrapped carefully in cloth, forgotten for 2 decades. He placed his hand over hers and asked if she wanted him to take it to be developed. She shook her head. It had to be her. It had to be her choice. For years, she had lived with unanswered questions, and she knew that if there was even the smallest chance this film contained something important, she needed to face it herself. The next morning, she placed the camera in her purse, her fingers tightening around the strap as if it might slip away. The walk to the small photo shop in town felt longer than it was, each step heavy with dread. The bell above the door jingled when she entered, and the clerk, a young man who could not have been alive when Emily vanished, greeted her with a smile that faded when he saw her face. She placed the camera gently on the counter, her voice low as she asked if the film could be developed. He explained that it might be damaged, that after 20 years the chances were slim, but he would do what he could. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. When she left the shop, the sun was warm on her shoulders, yet she felt cold, as if she had given away a piece of her heart. For 2 decades she had clung to silence, and now she had chosen to break it. The wait for the photographs would be unbearable, but the decision was made. Whatever truth the camera held, whether blur, shadow, or revelation, she was ready to face it. She had lived with not knowing for too long. The photo shop smelled of chemicals and paper, a sharp scent that clung to the air and settled into the corners. Behind the counter, the young clerk worked with careful hands, wearing thin gloves as he handled the fragile cartridge of film. He had seen old rolls before, but rarely one that had been sealed for 20 years. The plastic was brittle, the paper label yellowed with time, and as he pried it open, he wondered about the girl whose name had been written across the box that had carried it. He did not know her story in full, only fragments whispered in town, yet the weight of what he held was enough to make him move slower than usual. The chemicals were prepared, trays lined up on the counter, the dark room bathed in its faint red glow. He dipped the film carefully, rocking the tray back and forth with the practiced rhythm of someone trained to be patient. At first, there was nothing but cloudy streaks, gray shapes swimming in the liquid, and he feared the film was too far gone. But slowly, as if reluctant to return, images began to emerge, faint outlines sharpening into details. The first frames were ordinary, a picnic scene, children running with plates of food, women seated on blankets, the steeple of the church rising bright in the background. He recognized the meadow, though the trees looked smaller, younger, their shadows less heavy than they were now. Then came a picture of Emily herself, smiling with the sun in her hair, holding a cup of lemonade, her face caught mid-laugh. The image was blurred, yet clear enough to bring her presence into the room. For the clerk, it was just a photograph, but he felt a shiver, as though the past itself had reached forward through the chemicals. Further down the roll, the pictures grew stranger. One showed the meadow with no people in frame, only the edge of the woods in the distance. Another showed the blanket on the grass, plates still full, as if abandoned in a hurry. And then, near the end of the strip, there was one that froze him. The frame was darker than the others, shadow heavy along the edges, but in the center stood a figure. It was blurred, tall, turned slightly away, the face hidden in shadow. The outline was of a man, shoulders broad, one arm lifted, as if reaching or beckoning. Behind him, barely visible, the trees seemed to close in like a curtain. The clerk blinked, adjusting the focus, certain it was only a trick of light, a smear of age on the film. But no, the figure remained, unsettling in its clarity. He studied it until the shapes around him seemed to fade. A chill moved through the air, though the chemicals were warm. When he set the film aside to dry, the image lingered in his mind, more than just an accident of time. It was as if the camera had captured not only the moment, but something hidden beneath it, a ghost rising from the shadows of the meadow, waiting to be seen. The photographs were returned in a thin paper envelope, the kind used for decades by the shop, and when Emily's mother held it in her hands, it felt heavier than it should have. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the stack free, the glossy squares fanning slightly, their edges smelling faintly of chemicals. She braced herself for disappointment, for ruined frames of nothing but gray and blur, but the first picture made her gasp. There was Emily, caught mid-laugh, sunlight tangled in her hair, the small camera strap slung around her neck. The sight of her daughter's face after 20 years was so sharp, so alive, that her knees nearly buckled. She studied each picture slowly, unwilling to rush. The picnic spread came first, blankets scattered on the grass, women balancing plates, children chasing one another near the church steeple. The images held the innocence of that summer afternoon, yet looking at them now, she saw them differently, as if the edges of every smile carried a shadow. Then came the stranger frames, the ones that made her breath hitch. A view of the meadow with no people, the lens tilted toward the woods, the light uneven, almost hurried. Another of the blanket, food still arranged as though waiting for someone to return. Each photograph told part of the story, but none gave answers. Near the end of the stack, her hands grew still. The second-to-last frame showed the edge of the trees again, darker this time, as if the sun had slipped behind a cloud. Something about the way the shadows stretched felt unnatural, like a curtain falling across the meadow. And then she reached the last frame. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The picture was darker than the rest, almost swallowed in shadow, but in the center a figure stood. It was a man, broad-shouldered, turned partly away, his face obscured. One arm was lifted, bent at the elbow, as if reaching out, or signaling, or perhaps pulling something just out of sight. Her fingers traced the glossy surface, though she knew it would not give more than what was already there. The figure was too close to be a trick of the light, too clear to dismiss as accident. The longer she stared, the colder she felt, as if the picture itself carried the chill of the woods. She thought of Emily's small feet walking toward the trees, the sound of her laughter fading, the moment no one had seen. The last frame was not proof, not in the way the police would demand, but it was a fragment of truth, a window into the instant before everything changed. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the photograph to her chest. After 20 years, the camera had spoken, not with answers but with a haunting glimpse of what might have been. The last frame was not closure, it was a door left half open, showing just enough to remind her that the shadows of that day still lived in the silence of the town. The last frame did not leave her thoughts. Emily's mother carried it with her from room to room, placing it on the table, lifting it again, staring until the details seemed to shift. At first it was only the figure that consumed her, the shadow of a man turned partly away, but as the hours passed she began to notice the edges, the faint shapes behind him. The trees were there, their trunks dark and thin, but there was something else, a blur of structure, a hint of straight lines that did not belong to the wildness of the woods. She pressed the photograph closer to the lamp, the light catching the gloss, and there it was, faint but visible, the outline of a wooden fence. It was old, half-broken, the kind that farmers built decades ago to keep livestock from straying. Her breath caught. She knew that fence. It had run along the edge of the Barlow property, a stretch of land that touched the woods where the picnic had been held. The Barlows had left town years ago, their farmhouse sold and resold, but in her memory the fence remained. The realization filled her with both dread and purpose. She took the photograph to her brother-in-law, who had farmed near the Barlow place. He squinted at the picture, turning it in his hands, his brows knitting. "Yes," he said, "that slat. That post leaning just so. It looked like the fence by the north pasture, the one that had sagged since before he could remember." He tapped the picture, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might give the shadow more weight. That fence had been there in 1982. That was the place. Word spread quickly, as it always did in the town. Some said the photograph proved Emily had walked or been taken toward the Barlow property. Others dismissed it, claiming shadows played tricks, that fences were common, that memory stretched to fit grief. Yet the image had power. Neighbors began to whisper again, not about strangers, but about the people who had lived closest to that fence. Questions that had lain buried for 2 decades stirred uneasily. Why had the Barlows moved so suddenly a year after the disappearance? Why had their barn sat empty so long before it was sold? Why had no one searched deeper into that land? The sheriff, older now and slower, studied the photograph with tired eyes. He admitted the background might be the Barlow fence, though the picture was too blurred to be considered evidence. Still, he agreed to walk the land once more, to retrace ground that had been dismissed years before. Emily's mother insisted on coming, the photograph clutched tight in her hand. They stood at the edge of the woods, the meadow stretching behind them, and when she looked from the trees to the picture she felt the chill of recognition. The angles matched, the shadows fell the same way. The background was not just landscape, it was a map, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt the path forward was not lost in darkness, but waiting to be followed. The photograph had already unsettled the town, but it was not the fence or the shadowed trees that caught the most attention when the image passed from hand to hand. It was the blurred figure itself, the broad shoulders, the shape of the arm lifted mid-motion, a posture frozen forever in grainy detail. At first it seemed too vague to be anything more than suggestion, yet the longer people stared, the more certain they became that it was someone they knew. Small towns carry faces like heirlooms, stored in memory even when the names grow faint, and the last frame stirred that uneasy recognition. Emily's mother saw it first, though she hesitated to speak. She had lived with ghosts so long that she feared her eyes would trick her, shaping shadows into meaning. But in the curve of the jaw, in the slant of the shoulders, she thought she saw a boy she remembered from church. He had been 17 at the time of the picnic, older than most of the children, restless in ways that made the adults watch him with cautious eyes. His name was Daniel Hurst, and he had lived not far from the Barlow property, often cutting through the meadow on his way home. The thought lodged in her heart, and once it was there, it refused to leave. She remembered the way Daniel had hovered at the edges of the picnic that day, not quite part of the games, not quite belonging to the conversations of the grown. He had seemed uneasy, glancing toward the woods often, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. When Emily disappeared, the search had spread wide, and though Daniel had been questioned, nothing tied him to her absence. His family left town only a few years later, moving north after his father found work in another county. By the time the case grew cold, his name had stopped being spoken. When the sheriff looked at the photograph, he frowned, rubbing his thumb over the gloss. He admitted the outline could belong to many men, but he too felt a tug of recognition. Daniel had grown tall early, his frame awkward, his stance unmistakable. The sheriff remembered the boy's silence during questioning, the way he had shrugged and said little, offering alibis that were never checked as thoroughly as they should have been. At the time, they were chasing shadows, desperate for answers, and Daniel's presence had slipped away like everything else. Whispers filled the town again. Some claimed the figure looked like Daniel, others insisted it was only coincidence, a trick of light. But in quiet conversations on porches and in stores, people admitted they had always felt something unsettled about the boy. His temper, his long disappearances into the woods, the way he avoided the gaze of adults. For Emily's mother, the recognition was more than speculation. It was the first time in 20 years that a face had emerged from the fog of memory and silence. Whether the photograph proved anything or not, she could not shake the conviction that the last frame had captured not just a shadow, but someone real, someone she had known, someone who might still hold the secret of what happened to her daughter. The sheriff sat at his desk with the photograph spread before him, the edges curling slightly from the handling it had endured over the past weeks. The image was blurred and incomplete, yet the shape of the man in the trees would not let go of his mind. Emily's mother had spoken the name Daniel Hurst, and once it was spoken, others remembered him too. He had not been a close friend to anyone, nor a pillar of the church, but a quiet, restless boy who slipped in and out of the community without leaving much behind. A parishioner, yes, though forgotten almost as soon as his family left. The Hurst family had always sat near the back pew. They came to services irregularly, often late, and left quickly once the final hymn was sung. Daniel's father was a stern man, his eyes sharp, his mouth thin, while his mother kept her head down, never speaking more than a few words. Daniel himself had been tall for his age, his shoulders already filling out the frame of a man, yet he carried himself with a slouch, as if trying to fold back into boyhood. He was not cruel to the younger children, but he was not gentle either. He lingered at the edges, watching, sometimes offering a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. After Emily disappeared, the Hursts came to a few prayer meetings, their faces drawn, their voices flat as they offered words of concern. But within a year their attendance grew rare, and by the third year they were gone altogether. It was said they moved north for work, though no one had asked too many questions. The case had stalled, the leads dried up, and the town was eager to smooth the wound over with silence. Daniel was not mentioned again, his absence blending with all the other absences that time eventually collects. Now, with the photograph on the table, those memories stirred. Parishioners recalled the way Daniel had volunteered to help carry supplies during the picnic, how he had been seen walking near the woods that same afternoon. One woman remembered him standing by the lemonade table, his gaze fixed on Emily longer than seemed natural, though at the time she dismissed it as imagination. Another man recalled Daniel leaving the meadow early, his hands shoved into his pockets, striding off toward the fence line as if trying to escape notice. The sheriff felt the weight of regret pressing down. He knew he should have looked harder back then, pressed the boy with sharper questions, traced his movements beyond that one afternoon. But the Hurst family had been quiet folk, not close to anyone, and when they left it was easier to let them slip into memory than to follow. Now, 2 decades later, he faced the uncomfortable truth that a forgotten parishioner, overlooked and dismissed, might have been the key all along. For Emily's mother, the name was both a wound and a direction. The forgotten parishioner was no longer a ghost in the background, but a face rising from the shadows, and if he still lived, she vowed she would find him. The name Daniel Hurst lingered in the air like smoke, faint yet impossible to ignore. Emily's mother sat at her kitchen table with the photograph before her, the shadowed figure half turned, the fence line faint in the background. She whispered the name to herself again and again, as though saying it might summon answers. Daniel had been a parishioner, a boy fading into memory. But if he had truly walked away from the picnic that day with her daughter, then his trail would not end in shadows. There had to be something. A record. A trace. The sheriff, older now but still carrying the burden of that summer, agreed reluctantly to help. He began with the basics, the paper that never lies. Property records, school registers, employment files, anything that might show where Daniel had gone after his family slipped north. The courthouse was quiet in the afternoons, the heavy drawers of the archive cabinets sticking as he pulled them open. He flipped through brittle folders, dust rising into the stale air, each page a fragment of a life once ordinary. The trail began with school records. Daniel had left high school in his junior year, his file ending abruptly with the note, "Relocated out of district." No forwarding school was listed, no address given. The Hursts had been private people, and the move had been sudden. The next piece appeared in property tax files, a transfer of deed from the Hearst family to a distant cousin who sold the land soon after. The paper trail confirmed what people remembered, that the family had left quickly, leaving behind only debts and an empty house. From there, the search grew more difficult. The sheriff called county clerks in towns upstate, asking for any trace of the name. Slowly, bits of paper surfaced. A driver's license issued to Daniel Hurst 2 years after the picnic, an address listed in a small town by the river. A few years later, a police citation for disorderly conduct, then another for public drunkenness. They were small things, but they showed a pattern, a life marked by drifting and trouble. Emily's mother listened as the sheriff read the findings aloud, his voice heavy with the weight of time lost. Each scrap of paper felt like a ghost speaking, pulling Daniel closer from the fog. He was not gone, not erased. He had lived, moved, left marks behind. The question that burned was not whether he existed, but what role he had played in the silence of that day. The sheriff folded the documents carefully, placing them in a file marked with Emily's name. For 2 decades, the case had been empty, its pages thin, but now it grew heavier with each sheet of paper, each fragile record. Emily's mother pressed her hand to the folder as if it were a heartbeat. The paper trail did not give her daughter back, but it gave direction, a line of ink that pointed toward a man who might still carry the truth of what happened on that long-ago summer afternoon. The farmhouse stood at the end of a rutted lane, its windows dark and broken, its paint long since peeled away by rain and sun. Weeds grew tall against the foundation, spilling over the steps where children once sat with jars of lemonade in their hands. Emily's mother had not been back to this place since the Hursts left town, but the photograph, the paper trail, and the questions that refused to fade had drawn her here now. She stood at the gate with the sheriff beside her, the file of records tucked under his arm, both of them staring at the husk of the home that might still carry secrets. The boards creaked beneath their feet as they stepped onto the porch. The front door, half rotted, gave way with little effort, swinging inward to release a rush of stale air. Inside, dust lay thick over everything, a gray film that softened the sharp corners of the furniture left behind. A table leaned in one corner, its legs warped, a single chair tipped over beside it. Wallpaper curled away from the walls, revealing bare boards beneath. The house felt abandoned, but not empty, as though the walls themselves remembered voices that had once echoed here. They moved slowly from room to room, the sheriff shining his flashlight even in daylight, the beam catching on cobwebs and bits of broken glass. Upstairs, the small bedrooms told quiet stories of hurried departure. A mattress without sheets, a dresser with drawers yanked open, a single shoe forgotten beneath a bed frame. In the smallest room, where Daniel had likely slept, the wallpaper was marked with pencil lines, a tally of height scratched into the wood. It was the kind of detail that broke something inside Emily's mother, because it reminded her that he had once been just a boy, measured like all children are, even if that boy might have grown into the man in the photograph. At the back of the house, the kitchen window faced the woods, the same woods captured in the last frame. The view was almost unchanged after 20 years, the fence still leaning, the trees thick and close. Emily's mother pressed her hand to the glass, as though the scene outside might confess its silence. She tried to imagine Daniel standing there, watching the meadow, waiting. The cellar door groaned when they found it, tucked behind the kitchen. The air grew colder as they descended, their footsteps hollow on the wooden stairs. The cellar smelled of damp earth and rust. Old tools lay scattered across the dirt floor, their handles soft with decay. Against one wall a workbench stood, a jar of nails overturned beside it. On the far side they found carvings in the wood, rough initials scratched by an unsteady hand. The sheriff traced the letters D, H. With his finger, the grooves still sharp despite the years. Emily's mother shivered. It was not proof, not the kind the sheriff could take to court, but it was a mark of presence, a reminder that Daniel had lived here, breathed here, left himself in the grain of the wood. The farmhouse was abandoned, but it was not silent. It held pieces of him still, and with them, perhaps, the pieces of the truth she had been chasing for 20 years. The drive to the town where Daniel Hurst now lived was long and heavy with silence. Emily's mother sat in the passenger seat of the sheriff's car, the photograph in her lap, her fingers tracing the blurred outline of the figure in the trees. For 2 decades, she had lived with questions that had no answers, and now she was being carried toward the man who might hold them, though part of her feared what his words might confirm. The sheriff had agreed to speak with him first, to keep things calm, but she insisted on coming, knowing that nothing would quiet her unless she saw him with her own eyes. They arrived at a tired neighborhood on the edge of a larger town, rows of modest houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. Children's toys littered some of the yards, but the street was quiet, the air thick with late summer heat. Daniel's house was small, its roof patched, the grass uncut. A single truck sat in the driveway, rust along the wheel wells, the bed cluttered with tools. Emily's mother felt her stomach tighten at the sight, a sense of recognition stirring in her chest even before she saw him. When the door opened, Daniel stepped out slowly, blinking in the sunlight. He was older now, his shoulders still broad but slouched with weariness, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined in ways that suggested years of hard living. Yet, in the tilt of his jaw, in the way he narrowed his eyes against the brightness, she saw the same boy who had lingered near the lemonade table, the same shadow caught in the last frame of the camera. The sheriff greeted him with careful words, explaining why they were there, why a photograph from long ago had led them back to his door. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to unease, and then to something darker, a flash of irritation quickly hidden. He invited them inside reluctantly, the house cluttered with the smell of old coffee and dust. They sat at a small kitchen table, the sheriff laying the photograph between them. Daniel stared at it for a long time, his lips pressed tight. He shrugged at last, saying it could be anyone, the picture too blurry, the figure too unclear. But Emily's mother leaned forward, her voice soft but steady, asking him where he had gone after the picnic that day, why no one remembered seeing him when the search began. He shifted in his chair, his hands restless against the table, his eyes darting toward the window, as though measuring the distance to escape. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable. Then he said he had walked home, that was all, nothing unusual. His voice lacked conviction, and in his refusal to meet her eyes, she heard the weight of something unsaid. Her heart pounded, the years of waiting pressing down on her chest. She told him she did not want excuses, she did not want stories, she only wanted to know what had happened to her daughter. Daniel looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment she thought she saw guilt flicker across his face, a shadow of memory too heavy to erase. He did not confess, not yet, but the past was no longer distant. It sat at the table with them, as real as the photograph between their hands, demanding to be faced. The photograph lay in the center of the sheriff's desk, its edges curled and worn from so many hands passing it along, its glossy surface dulled by fingerprints and time. To anyone else it might have seemed like nothing more than a blurred picture left too long in a forgotten camera, a moment captured by chance and left undeveloped for decades. But for Emily's mother, and for those who remembered that summer picnic, it had become more than paper and ink. It was a key, a doorway, a fragment of truth clawing its way out of silence. For years, the story of Emily's disappearance had been told in half-whispers, with pauses heavy enough to swallow whole sentences. People spoke of strangers who might have wandered into town, of the woods that could hide anyone, of the mistakes of parents who looked away for only a moment. But the photograph pushed aside those vague theories. It showed, however imperfectly, that someone had been there. Someone standing near the fence, half cloaked by the trees, caught in the act of watching. Emily's mother saw more than shape in that shadow. She saw intent, a presence, a reason the blanket had been left empty that afternoon. To her, the figure was not faceless at all. It carried memory, the boy who had sat in the back pew, the restless teenager who never seemed to fit, the forgotten parishioner whose name had been nearly erased from the town's memory. The photograph made him real again, dragging him back from obscurity. The sheriff understood its power differently. To him it was not proof, at least not the kind that could stand in a courtroom, but it was enough to stir the old case from the dust. It meant a lead where none had existed for 20 years. It meant there was still a chance to ask questions, to follow paper trails, to hold someone accountable after decades of failure. He knew photographs could be twisted, light could deceive, angles could mislead, yet he also knew that memory often sharpened when faced with an image. The moment the townsfolk saw it, they remembered things they had not thought about in years, small details that suddenly mattered. For the community, the photograph was unsettling in ways they could not voice. It meant the story they had told themselves for comfort, that Emily had wandered off or been taken by someone passing through, was not the whole truth. It suggested the answer had always been closer, living in the pews, walking the same roads, sharing their food at the picnic tables. It was easier to blame strangers than to admit that danger might have grown in their own soil. The photograph tore at that fragile comfort, exposing an old wound that never healed. Late at night, Emily's mother would hold the picture under the lamp and stare at the faint lines of the fence, the blurred outline of the figure, and the sunlight captured forever through the trees. To her, it was not just an old photo. It was Emily reaching back from the past, telling her that the truth had always been there, waiting, demanding to be seen,